how saintly we get, we all are human. And as I often say, I'm going to be a human with human thoughts until about 3 days after I've been planted. And at that time, I expect perfection will begin to set in. If it doesn't say amen, I'm in trouble. We never will. Have you ever tried to sell anything? Would I be wrong if I told you that I suspect everybody in this room, at one time or another in their life, have tried to sell something? Maybe something as simple as trying to tell somebody that vegetables or some other kind of food tastes good. That's a kind of a selling idea. And you remember the serpent in the early story trying to convince Eve it's okay to take that forbidden fruit. Probably went something like this. Well, remember, Eve, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. You see, salespeople have always been with us. Some of you probably remember the days of the door-to-door salesman and the days when a Bible salesman would come around knocking on your door and try to sell a Bible. And one guy I read said, it didn't always work to tell that Bible salesman that you didn't have the money to buy the Bible, because he was apt to hold up a Bible and said, would you put your hand on this book and swear to that you don't have the money to buy the Bible. An anonymous bard has written, most salesmen get in heaven in spite of how they rate. Before St. Peter stops them, a foot is inside the gate. But how would you feel if you encountered a salesman who really wasn't convinced of the value of his own product? There are some salesmen like that, and maybe there's a message in that idea about what we just read in the scripture today about being real in what you say and what you think and what you do. There's a New Testament scholar by the name of N.T. Wright, and he tells a story about a man who went into a sporting goods store to buy hiking and camping equipment. And the salesman took him all around the store, showing him everything he would need for the perfect camping experience. And he began to load things up on the counter. A durable tent, a good sleeping bag, cooking pots and pans and a little stove, maps, flashlights, knife, first aid kit, and then the final thing that he got him was a great big backpack. And he loaded all of this gear into the backpack, put it on the counter, and the customer was not able to lift the backpack. It was too heavy. So he turned around and he slipped his arms into the straps after he paid for all of the gear, and he started trying to walk out of the store, and it was bringing him almost down, and he was huffing and puffing as he began to leave the store. And he asked the salesman, he said, what do you do for vacations? Where do you go? And he says, well, I never go camping, because he said I couldn't carry all that stuff on my back. I go to the beach where I don't have to carry everything. See, the customer couldn't even pick it up, but the salesman was perfectly willing to sell him something that he would not use himself. Well, Jesus was trying to tell us the same thing about these priests who would sell you one thing but do another. They didn't practiced what they preached. And Jesus says, these teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must be careful to do everything that they tell you to do, but don't do what they do, because they don't practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and they put them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do, Jesus added, is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide and their tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and they love to be called rabbi by others. But Jesus said, but you're not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And you do not call anyone on earth Father, for you have one instructor, that's the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. At first reading, if you didn't know any better, you might think that Jesus was being anti-Jewish, or maybe even anti-Catholic, and anti-education. But that's not what he was. Jesus was anti-hypocrite. He was anti-snob. The greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. This passage is directed towards anyone who pretends to be something they are not. And that's what we're talking about this morning. Are those, perhaps Christians, who pretend to be something that they really are not. Have you ever met somebody like that?
Tuesday's election.
Boy, it is important for us to see that Jesus does not want his followers to pretend that they are something that they are not. He would not approve of the old sales maxim that says, fake it until you make it. And we actually say that sometimes in 12-step programs to people who have not yet been able to get faith, to fake it till you make it. But faith and fakery live in two different worlds. And when I think of that, I think of a man named Nicolae Ceausescu. Many of you may remember reading about him. He was a former president of communist Romania. And he was a dictator of the absolute worst kind. And he was a hypocrite. Ceausescu liked to present himself as a man of the people. And that was a tricky business because he despised people. He didn't want them around. He didn't like them at all. And even worse, he had a phobia of catching germs by shaking hands with people. And so before Ceausescu would go out into the streets to be photographed shaking hands with the public, his secret police would go out in advance and they would disinfect the hands of those who they chose for Ceausescu to shake hands with. And then he would go out and shake hands and have the photographers take pictures, and they would think he was really a man of the people. And he was a man of the people if they were disinfected first. And it would not surprise that this man, who pretended to love his people, who really didn't, was guilty of many crimes against these same people. So in December 1989, there was a popular uprising in Romania, And that led to his arrest and his execution, along with that of his wife, Elena. You see, there's something repulsive about a person who pretends to be one thing and really is another. I don't know if you know what the origin of the word hypocrite is. It comes from the Greek word commonly used with theater, with actors on the stage. Hypocrites were, in fact, actors on a stage. And since actors played many different roles and they wore masks so that they could portray whatever role they were supposed to be in, they wore the mask. And soon the word hypocrite came to denote anyone who wears a different face. One face in one situation and one face in quite another. And many of us have had some unfortunate experiences with those kind of people, hypocrites. And that is what Jesus is telling us this morning in the message, not to be. Not to be a hypocrite about our religion. Not to think one thing and do another. Well, there was a man that Pastor Scott Harrell tells us about in a writing. His name was Roy. Roy was brought up in the church. And unfortunately, Roy's family was a bizarre, legalistic church family that warped his life. His dad was a pillar of the church. He was always there at church whenever the doors opened. He served as a deacon, and he was considered by his people in the church as a real upright Christian man. At home, though, Dad was different. Dad was an abusive monster. And as soon as he could, Roy bolted from home, and he bolted from the church, wanting nothing to do with it. Roy went on to be a crude, rude man, and he always looked out for old number one. He didn't pretend to be one thing at church and be another thing at home. Roy didn't pretend at all. He was a scoundrel, and he was a cheat, and he didn't care about anybody, and he didn't care who knew it. However, much to the surprise of his congregation, Roy started coming back to church when he was about 60 years old. He'd walk in late, he'd sit in the back row, and he'd listen for a while, but he wouldn't get involved, and he would always leave before the service ended. Pastor Harold would try to talk to Roy about his faith, but Roy wouldn't have anything to do with the gospel, or would he have anything to do with all those hypocrites who were like his dad in the church. But he kept coming, and he kept listening, and he watched. But mostly what he watched was the people at church. Within a couple of years, God got a hold of Roy and changed his life. And the people of the church loved Roy to Christ, according to Pastor Harold. And Scott Harold goes on to say this about Roy. Today, he's a sweet, loving man. Evidently, Roy began to see that the people of that church as a whole were nothing like his abusive father. Roy's father was a hypocrite, to be sure, the worst kind of hypocrite. And I would hate to think that people who go to our churches today would be a monster lurking, hiding behind being a good Christian in church and not being so otherwise. But I will say this, at least for Roy's father. He took Roy to church. and at least the child was exposed to the message of Jesus Christ. And I kind of imagine that's part of the reason why at 60 years of age he finally came back to the church. Even if he was just trying to scope it out, even if he was trying to see that those who came to church were really, as he suspected, hypocrites. You know, sometimes I think we're all a little bit of a hypocrite. And I'll bet you each one of us at one time in our life have wondered over one issue or another if we aren't just a little bit of a hypocrite. We may not be like Roy's father, but none of us are perfect. There is no such thing, I believe, as the perfect Christian. But there's one thing we can do. If we're exposed to children, we can bring them to church. If we're exposed to others who don't go to church, we can show them what a Christian looks like when he lives out his life on a daily basis. And we can encourage them to come find out what it looks like in our church. And people do. I hear it frequently. I heard it long before I got in the ministry. Talk about, well, those people who go to church, they're nothing but hypocrites. They go there on Sunday and talk about how great they are, and then on Monday they're not doing what they say they do. There are hypocrites in every organization. If we were perfect, we wouldn't need the grace that God gives to us and the church provides. What could be more hypocritical than someone who says he or she loves their children and does not make sure that their children are steeped in the knowledge that God loves them? Christ's message for us can be summarized in this passage by 2 words: get real. We need to take off the masks that we wear and live in the real world. Many people, as I said, don't go to church because they claim that those of us who do are all hypocrites. But you know, one excuse for not going to church is just as good as another, I suppose. But what we need to be aware of is that people outside the church are watching. They're watching before they come to church. They watch us when we're in church. And they watch us after church. And the last thing that people want to see is a show. What they long to see is simply those who live out the gospel of Jesus Christ, the gospel that Jesus Christ brought love to everyone, that we are people of authenticity, and we are people of character, and we are people who can always be trusted. Now that Halloween is over, we can put our masks away. It's time to take them off and to live the faith that we say that we believe in. That is to walk the walk that we talk. That is what it means to be real. To not pretend to be something that we really are not. In Jesus' 2 words, get real. Amen.